Heyo, you're listening to Edge Coach Quip, featuring our very own Edge coaches and community, dropping knowledge nuggets to fuel your day. Heyo, welcome to Coach Quip. This is episode 88. And today we're talking about
choosing races.
It's that time of year.
It is that time of year. And for a lot of people, actually, maybe it's beyond that time of year. We are in the spring. So some of you early planners may have already chosen all of the races that you're doing. And maybe some of you even raced already. But for the rest of us, myself included, we are looking forward at this year, planning our fall races, maybe our late summer events that we'll take part in. And in this episode, we're talking about choosing races and all of the different things that you should consider beyond just the race distance and the date that it takes place.
We're going to approach this topic in a way that's going to help you decide what race to do if you're thinking about things, but maybe haven't signed up yet. When you're planning your season, I know my brain works 100% in a 12-month cycle and a calendar. So thinking about that calendar, what do we need to take into consideration?
Yeah, so we need to think about a couple of things in terms of the race calendar, in terms of where your races actually fall. So I would say this is probably the most common question that we get as coaches is when should I choose my race? So I have a fall race, say a full marathon that I'm doing in the fall. What should I choose between now and then, and where should it go? So our athletes are aware about racing too close together, but sometimes we don't understand how we should space things out.
I think that it gets really hard to know how soon we should race before the race too. Loosely, I'll say something, don't put this back on me and say that it messed you up. But in general, racing's great. Don't over race, of course, but don't hesitate to race, especially if you haven't been racing a lot leading up to your race day. It's going to help you get a benchmark, i.e. get some paces dialed in of how your training is going, as well as just practice and get some nerves maybe settled and under control because you're moving through the motions. It's also important to make sure that there's enough time on the flip side leading up to the event so that you can properly really train and race for it. I can't tell you how many times, especially coming out of COVID, people will say like, well, I want to do a half Ironman. And I'm like, well, you have 10 weeks and you haven't been doing X, Y, and Z. So that's going to be a pretty steep on-ramp. We might want to choose something further out.
Yeah, so you need to make sure you have a long enough runway to the race, but also that race isn't butting up against another goal that you have. So you can really only peak once every, how often would you say?
For marathon and distance and up, science says you can really only peak at 100% about twice a year, no sooner than 5 months apart. And that's how the pros do it at 100%. You can certainly race under your potential more often than that and shorter than that.
Yeah, and we know that some people do choose to do multiple marathons or Ironmans in a year, and maybe their goals are a little bit different, right? Maybe it's not about setting PRs for them. Maybe it's about the experience of racing. But if you're really looking to get the most out of your own potential, you're going to want to make sure that you have space in between. And that means that you can only have one A race or priority race about every 6 months. When you're planning those additional races to fill in your race calendar, you need to consider those as maybe like practice races, like you said, or an opportunity to get experience leading up to your big race. So as an example, I have somebody who's racing their first Ironman this year, and they've never done a triathlon. So we're not going to, big goals. We're not going to jump them right to Ironman distance. They're going to do a half, an Olympic, and a sprint prior to that goal so that they have the experience, so that they know what the races are like, so that they can kind of anticipate what that longer distance might be like as well.
Absolutely. The best way to kind of think about that, and this is how our coaches build out your plans as well, is that we ask you always to establish them in terms of hierarchy of A, meaning the ones you just want to put all of your eggs in that basket, B's and C's. You can even have D's, right? If you have ones that are truly kind of, maybe for fun or doing them with family and there's no goal other than finishing. There is nothing wrong with having a bunch of B's and C's on the radar as long as you truly race them as B, C, D potential, because that way, to Coach Chris's point, you're not blowing yourself up before your A deposit.
Yeah, you need to remember as you're racing them to your potential, right? And you're thinking about what the aftermath of a race looks like as well. And so while you can race every weekend, I would say that it is really important to remember that when you race, when you're actually putting out a race effort or 100% effort or as close to 100% as you can give when you're racing, you're going to need some time to bounce back. So depending on the distance of the race, the type of event that you're doing, it could set you back a week or more in training. So you need to consider that as well. You don't want that to interrupt a big block of work leading up to what your real serious A goal is.
Sounds like a great opportunity to work with a coach.
It does sound like a great opportunity to coach, because as a coach, we can have eyes on that bigger picture when we're athletes. And this is the reason why coaches have coaches too.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
That when we're athletes, we are thinking about leading up to that goal, maybe the daily steps that we have to accomplish, but it can be difficult sometimes to zoom out and get that big picture of what we need and how to put all the pieces together. So it's not just about the calendar for planning your races. There are many other things that you should be thinking about as well. And we're going to get to those in just a moment in our bonus miles. Welcome back for our bonus miles. We are talking about the things that you should be thinking about in terms of planning your race schedule for the year. So we had talked about the timing of where your races are, which is the really obvious one. You don't want to race too close together, and you can use shorter races or B or C goal races as training races leading up to your big event. But there are many other things that you need to be thinking about as well. So let's go through a couple of them. The first one I think would be thinking about travel logistics and cost. So I think we're in this time where a lot of people want to get out and they want to race not locally, right? And we were kind of bound to our home territory during COVID.
Yeah.
And a lot of us weren't racing at all. And when we came back to racing, we were doing the smaller local races, which are awesome, and we should definitely support those. But the sense that I get as a coach is that more of my athletes have that itch to have that travel experience.
Yes, the big one.
Yes, to tie their racing to some sort of vacation or time away. Okay, so when you're planning your race, you need to think not just about the calendar, but also about that travel. So you have a lot of costs that are associated with this. We have registration fees, which will be the same for any race, whether you're traveling locally or racing locally or abroad. But we also have things like hotels. So you're going to need a place to stay. When you are thinking about your stay in a race, do you want your hotel to be close to the expo? Do you want it to be close to the start line? And if it's a point to point, do you want it to be close to the finish line? So you have to look at the map of the course and see where everything sort of aligns, figure out the right hotel, and then also, of course, figure out the pricing of the hotels if you want to stay in a more luxurious area or a more desirable area where some of these races actually take place. Then you need to be thinking about food, right? So when you travel, of course, you're gonna have to eat all of your meals out unless you get a hotel with a kitchen. And even then you're gonna have to buy groceries and it becomes more complicated. Yep. So you really need to be able to plan your meal your night before the race. So ideally in training, you've been practicing with food before your event. So if you're running a marathon, you've been practicing that night before meal, before your long runs, or if you're doing an Ironman, the same thing. But when you're traveling abroad, you might not actually be able to access those things that you are used to.
Yeah, totally different.
So you'll either need to pack them and take them with you, or do a little bit of research on the front end. So that would be something like looking at Yelp or Google to see what sort of restaurants or grocery stores are in the area and what you'll have access to, because you can't assume that everyone will have your favorite sushi roll that you like to eat the night before your race.
Next up, air and ground travel, right? This is how to get there and what the heck we're going to do to kind of get around. Checking bags. If you're flying Southwest, you're probably okay, right? But everyone else, there's going to be an additional cost. If you're flying with your bike, there's definitely an additional cost. And those airlines vary pretty significantly in how much that actually costs. Packing nutrition. This is a big one on air travel, especially. Make sure that if you're going somewhere, to your earlier point, that you know what the heck you're supposed to be using, what you practice with, and you know that you can get it safely to your destination. So whether that is, putting in your check bag, putting it in your carry-on, making sure that it's on you. A funny aside is that I had an athlete race Paris and they messed this up. And they did pack and I said, I'll just do whatever's on the race course. I'm like, all right, what's on the race course? They're like, I'll look at the expo. I don't think they looked at the expo. So race day comes and it wasn't a super A race. They wanted to do it more of an experience. Good news, hydration, they had kind of a Gatorade equivalent. So that was okay. Bad news, instead of gels, they had dried fruit. Now, dried fruit is not inherently bad, but it can absolutely rock your GI tract if you have not been practicing with it because of the higher levels of fiber. And I think they had nuts as well. Like it was, just very Euro, which was great, but very much not practiced. And it threw them, they ended up having to do a lot more liquid nutrition than solid nutrition because of it. So just take care. Another thing about air and ground travel is, are you racing at altitude? And if you are, doing your research on when you want to get there and what those kind of costs are, general rule of thumb is you want to race within and be done with your race within 3 days of landing, or you're going to have a 3-week priming period, depending on how high you are. Like when our groups go to Leadville or race really anywhere at altitude, we want them to land and really get there and be able to stay, under 9,000 feet and then be able to race by day 2 so that they don't get any types of negative effects. So as you plan that out, that's an important piece. In terms of ground transportation too, do you have to rent a car? Is there a ride share? Is there a bus? Do you have to take public transport, which would be really hard with a bike? All of these pieces are kind of fun, right? If you're going to a cool destination, but just knowing what you're getting into, as you're considering a race, I would definitely take them into consideration.
Yeah, for the bike travel is a big one, and thinking about just that extra piece of logistics, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of hauling it around, right?
And putting it back together.
So yeah, I think when you're thinking about a race like that, you need to make sure that one, you have access to a bike bag. You either own your own or you can borrow or rent a case so that you can safely get your bike to where you're going. That's a great place. In that bike bag is a great place to do some additional packing. So I was thinking about the nutrition. I often put my nutrition in with my bike because I always have concerns about flying with gels.
I agree with you.
And, it kind of depends on the TSA agent that you get and how many you're carrying with you. But each gel individually should be able to go onto a plane in theory. But I've also had my nutrition taken from me in the past. So it's something that I don't want to risk. I usually pack it, but then that also runs the risk of it not showing up.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if my bike doesn't show up, I'm probably not racing.
When you're a triathlon, you don't need the nutrition.
Yeah. But on the way home, I have in the past mailed my bike back as opposed to carrying it because I wanted to extend my vacation. So I raced in Switzerland and rode in Switzerland and Italy, and then mailed my bike back so that I could go to Paris for the rest of the trip, which was a brilliant idea and also a little nerve-wracking to wait for your bike in the mail. So those are things that you have to consider as you're traveling with a bike.
And to your point on that, really factoring any time off that you need after the race. So this is where you were saying, racecations are very popular because they're doing it in exactly the order that Coach Chris just talked about, where you go, you race, and then you get to coast a little, but you're going to need to have a plan of what to do with all of your gear after. It is easier to do with running races, I will say, than triathlons. But just have that plan in place, as well as knowing what you should be doing during that truly kind of reverse taper. But racecations and runcations can be some of the best vacations. So we promote them. All right, next up, are you going to be changing time zones? Oh, I'm so good going west, going east. I'm a mess. I'm a mess. So I always race going west because who cares after, right? Planning your weekend training. So especially your long stuff, you can really start to time this out as you get closer to your start, as long as it's sort of the same time zone, like 1 or 3 hours off even, so that you can start moving at the same time as the race start is going to be happening in whatever time zone that you are racing in. That is a pro tip right there.
That is a serious pro tip. And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of nutrition as well. And it can be complicated, right? So if you're thinking about, if you're going east, and it would be earlier here than where you're racing, to replicate that can be kind of difficult. West is a little bit easier because 7 a.m. in California is going to be a generous 9 a.m. here in Chicago. But still, if you have gotten in the habit of having a leisurely morning and maybe taking your long runs or long rides in the 9, 10, 11 o'clock hour, or you perform better in the afternoons, it's going to be in your best interest to start to shift that to the morning time, regardless of where you're racing, but especially if you're changing time zones, so you can kind of become more accustomed to that.
Totally. Yeah, that's a big one too, especially if people have a race that has even weirder there are races that have very strange start times, like a Disney marathons and Disney series, they start at 3 to 4 a.m.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so that they can be done by the time the park's open. And that is something very unique. And definitely want to practice that, especially if you're trying to race it.
Yeah, definitely.
Also climate. So what kind of climate are you racing in? Like, how are you going to experience that? International racing is happening so much, right? And people are making those race vacations, but then it's also like you have to prep for the race and also the climate, both before, during, and after, whether that's summer or winter or fall. Do your research on that area and try to replicate those conditions as much as possible. And this is kind of a fun variable, I think, because it can be just so wildly different than here, but you also need to go into it, I would say, educated on what it might be like there, so that even if you can't practice in it to perfection, you can at least anticipate it and plan for it.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially, we live in a place where in Chicago, we get 3 seasons in a day. Just this weekend, it was, 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago, it was 70 degrees. It snowed again this weekend. And, we've had rain and cold and warm and everything in between, all in a matter of a couple of days, and sometimes even in the same day. So it can be complicated to train. Yes, also terrifying. It can be complicated to train for your race and understand when the weather here fluctuates so much. But it does make a difference to not do all your training inside, as an example, to get outside, to experience the elements, to enjoy nature, but also to, try to figure out if it's going to be summer or warmer when your race is happening, how do you replicate that when you're training through a cold winter? And that's something that you have to consider and maybe work with the coach on to try to find the ways to more closely align so that you don't just go totally into shock when you get to your race destination.
And similarly, think about that race terrain. Do your research on how hilly is it? What is the texture like, especially if it's a trail run? A lot of those races will actually rank how on a 1 to 5 scale of how technical it is, as well as how mountainous it is. And that's really important to take into consideration when you are training. And also, what can you do? Sort of like Coach Chris's point, if it's the middle of winter here, how do you train for summer running? But also, if your 50K has 10,000 feet of climbing, how do you do that here? There are ways. But again, getting in with a group, working with a coach, those are really going to arm you to be able to anticipate it on race day. One caveat to all of that is as you move through your, being able to race and choose races truly right now, and what a privilege we are to be able to choose where we race and how we race and when we race. But start thinking about what resonates with you. Like me personally, I'm at the stage where I like to be able to train on similar terrain to what I'm racing on. I do not have a desire personally to go and race at 10,000 feet because I can't go and train at 10,000 feet. And I don't need it perfect, but I do need it sort of similar, right? Some people like that element of challenge and they thrive in that, and that's cool. But as you consider all of these racing options, think about what's resonating with you right now. And who knows, maybe in 5 years, you're going to find me at 10,000 feet racing a 100-miler, but this season, nah.
Yeah, and it's not just about what resonates, it's what is also practical for you in your life right now, right? So can you find time to train in the variety of ways necessary to race on terrain that you don't have access to?
Great point.
So that you feel prepared when you show up. So if you're doing a very hilly marathon, that's going to be in a warm conditions, and you're in a flat place and instead of winter, is that the race that you want to choose? And again, maybe it's a yes because you like a challenge, maybe it's a no because you want to train similarly, but you need to be thinking about those things as you're planning.
All right. In summary, we're recapping all of the bonus miles. First up, scheduling. Make sure that you can kind of lay out your year, pick those 2 aid races, and then back in the B's to C's.
Second up, travel. So you need to be thinking about your air travel or ground travel, how you'll get around when you get to your race location, where you're going to stay, and where you're going to eat.
Next up, food. It's an important one. Figuring out not only how you're going to get your own nutrition down there so that you can use it effectively, but also where are you going to eat while you're there? How are you going to consume food pre and post race?
Definitely. And then the climate and terrain. So thinking about where you're going, what is the climate like? How does it align with the climate that you can train in? And what does the terrain look like? Can you train adequately to accomplish your goals on that sort of race?
All right, we want to hear what you're planning. So tag us in your race planning posts and we will see you soon.
Thanks for listening to Coach Quip, original music performed by Mend. Follow us online on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Edge Athlete Lounge. Our podcast lives in the blog section of our website. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, and you can check out the show notes for additional ways to contact us. Ready, set, onward we go.